what about the poor? Isn't helping the poor showing our love for our fellow man as well? In Deuteronomy chapter 15 verse 11, it says, "For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, and to thy needy, in thy land." In Proverbs chapter 19 verse 17, it says, "He that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord, and that which he hath given will he pay him again." In James chapter 2 verse 5, it says, "Hearken, my beloved brethren, hath not God chosen the poor of this world, rich in faith, and heirs of the kingdom which he hath promised to them that love him?" In Proverbs chapter 14 verse 31, it says, "He that oppresseth the poor reproacheth his maker, but he that honoreth him hath mercy on the poor." In Proverbs chapter 17 verse 5, it says, "Whoso mocketh the poor reproacheth his maker, and he that is glad at calamities shall not be unpunished." In 1 John chapter 3 verse 17, it says, "But whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him?" So we see bluntly in Deuteronomy chapter 15 verse 11, Proverbs chapter 19 verse 17, and James chapter 2 verse 5, the Lord is telling us to help the poor, and it is often the poor who are rich in faith and are heirs of his kingdom. And if we do not help the poor, basically we dishonor God and show that we do not love him. According to Proverbs chapter 14 verse 31, Proverbs chapter 17 verse 5, and 1 John chapter 3 verse 17. And that's another thing. By lusting after the money and the things of this world, are we showing our love for God? Well, Paul did mention in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, while some coveted after they erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19 verse 23 and 24, "Then Jesus said unto his disciples, Verily I say unto you, that a rich man shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." Now, I'm not saying that having money is bad. I'm just saying that the Lord never wants us to spend endless amounts of time just thinking about it. He wants us to always keep our faith in him rather than what man can give to us. In Hebrews chapter 13 verse 5, it says, "Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." Now, in the Strong Concordance G5366, it defines covetousness as loving money. So Hebrews chapter 13 verse 5 is telling us not to allow our minds to be filled with the thoughts of money. Because John said in 1 John chapter 2 verse 15, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him." So if we cling to the prize of this world, we are not really loving God the way that we should. Matter of fact, this is showing God we rather put our trust in ourselves or what the world can provide to us rather than what God can provide to us. Because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon." And if you don't know what mammon is, in the Strong Concordance G3126, it defines mammon as treasures or riches. John said in 1 John chapter 2 verse 16, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world." So by spending time worrying about money, riches, and the things of this world, we are showing God we do not love Him. Yet, we're doing what is mentioned in John chapter 12, verse 43, where Jesus says, "For they love the praise of men more than the praise of God." And it is the same when it comes to following the laws of man rather than the laws of God. To give examples of this, God tells us in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, "And God blessed them. And God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and every living thing that moveth upon the earth." In Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, "And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth." God tells us to replenish the earth in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. But our world leaders tells us that we need to shorten the world's population. We even see evidence of this when Bill Gates is explaining how the pharmaceutical companies and drugs are doing a great job with shortening the population in his depopulation agenda. God tells us not to engage in acts of fornication. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8 and 9, it says, "I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn." In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2, it says, "Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3, it says, "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication." And the world believes as long as you wear a condom or take birth control, it is okay to have sex before marriage.